Is your team not performing well? Is morale low and turnover high? Are you falling further behind the competition? I'm here to help. I'm your host, Jeanie, and this is the Leadership Show, where business strategy and culture finally meet, and we make the long-awaited shift from rhetoric to results. I promise I'm not your typical boring leadership consultant, and I will help you get your shift together. Let's do this.
Hello, Leadershifters, and welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Show with Jeanie. It is now 2021, and we are so thrilled to be back after a little bit of a hiatus. You know, we had to move from Boulder back to Fort Lauderdale to take care of some family health business, and we are raring to go. And boy, do I have a treat for you today. Not one, but two brilliant women who are here to talk about appreciative inquiry. So hold on to that. If you don't know what that is, we will obviously explain and take a deep dive. So welcome to the show, Joan McArthur-Blair and Jeanie Cockell. They are appreciative inquiry consultants and the authors of two books on the subject. One is called Building Resilience with Appreciative Inquiry, and I cannot wait to dive into that one, just given the fact that we're coming up on a year of COVID hibernation and the like. And their other book is called Appreciative Inquiry in Higher Education, which for those of you who know me, higher education, all education is a real side passion of mine. And actually, Jeanie and I were talking before the show that both of our mothers were English teachers. We share that passion for grammar and love that they're bringing this into the classroom. So welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Jeanie. And Joan has a degree in English. So just to carry on that story.
Yeah.
People who care about English here.
And what's funny, folks, is they are joining us from Victoria, British Columbia, where it is cold and gray and rainy. And of course, I am back in sunny, beautiful Fort Lauderdale. And I just love the contrast and the fact that we can get on a Zoom call and do this regardless of weather conditions.
And you know, just to kind of lead off that for a second, you know, this is the thing in leadership. You know, I've been in formal leadership for a lot of my life, and it is that undertaking in contrasts, where, you know, one moment it's dark and rainy, and the next day, you know, there's that sunshine that allows you to do something that wasn't there the day before. You know,
Absolutely.
It's an amazing undertaking.
Yep. Well, so let's start with the basics. Appreciative inquiry, a concept known to folks who are in leadership development, learning and development, but maybe not everyone is as familiar with it. So go ahead and do a little bit of teaching for the listeners here. What is appreciative inquiry?
Oh, let me start with that one. Yeah, appreciative inquiry is something that's absolutely true to my heart. And when I discovered it just through other consultants and facilitators at a conference, somebody said, "Have you heard about appreciative inquiry?" This is years ago. No, and we're still finding that people haven't heard about it. It's basically those two words, appreciative inquiry, and the appreciative comes from, you know, valuing and looking at what you value,
Yep.
inquiring into it. Inquiry is questioning and exploring and researching. So together is, what do you appreciate? What do you value? Because by looking at it, you'll get more of it. In other words, the notion of appreciate as a house appreciates in value, right? Well, what you're looking at, if you're looking at your strengths and what's working well in your organization, that will increase. And you know, do it through, you know, research and examination and questions and conversations and stories. But there's a third one that Joan and I have actually added on to the notion of appreciate, and that's the notion of, you also have to be fully aware. To appreciate means to be fully aware.
Mm,
And we're finding that, especially in the world now where we want to look at, the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging and so on. And sometimes you have to actually start with what isn't actually perfectly working in order
right.
to explore through an appreciative lens, through appreciative inquiry, but to acknowledge first the importance of advocating for change in our world where things are issues still, and then look at how is it we explore what is working within that issue. How is
Mm,
it people are making changes? And that's the appreciative inquiry part, is to ask those questions, look for the stories, get those stories spread around the organization or the team or the community or the world. It's a worldwide exploration through processes and ways of being in the world by continually doing that curiosity and appreciation.
absolutely. I love that. And because one of the things that I do is a lot of executive and leadership coaching, I'll introduce this concept of appreciative inquiry as as a lens from which to ask more questions, because like I'll get this question all the time. Well, what's the one thing I can do as a leader to be better? Like, don't you have a hack? Right? You work with tons of leaders. Isn't there like a secret sauce or a hack to being a better leader? And I'm like, well, okay, first of all, not really. But if I had to recommend one thing, it would be to talk less and listen more. And when we are talking, instead of just coming out spouting our knowledge, it's asking more questions when we are opening that mouth of ours. And I, for a lot of people, have to clarify, we're not asking questions as a way to put people on the defensive. They're not questions designed to trick people or lead people to your own conclusion. They have to be open-ended, non-leading questions. And that's when I'll bring in this idea of, come from a place of just being purely curious and appreciating what you might hear and appreciating what you already know, as opposed to jumping to conclusions, which is what most people do.
Well, and I think it's so powerful where you just touched on the idea that appreciative inquiry can be used in the smallest of ways, to
Yes.
ask a simple generative question as a leader to others, to think through the ways in which you open the possibility for somebody else to share their strength in a situation,
Yes.
the kinds of questions you ask. Or it can be used for whole system change, where you're looking at big organizational and cultural change. And, we were talking for a minute before we started today, the idea of culture, to be asked as somebody who works in an organization what my ideas are, where we might go, what I'm hoping for, is such a powerful generator of positive culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such in some ways, I was about to say it's such a simple thing, but it's not. It's actually a practice of asking generative questions that create positive responses for people.
Yes. And let's actually build on that and give some examples. Those were great examples of questions that you might ask an individual. How would this apply to greater organizational change? Either, if you have sort of an overview of the process that you use incorporating appreciative inquiry, or even, an example.
Well, Jeanie and I do a lot of big strategic planning processes, and that's one of the classic places that large organizations can use this. And for an example, we did a big project in the States with a university where they asked the entire internal university community, students and everybody who worked inside the university and the community, to come and tell stories of the university. And then out of those stories, they created kind of theme ideas. And each of those themes was then kind of parsed for ways the organization might design the future. And it's so powerful in that kind of whole system change where everybody gets involved. And so what happens in that process is, it's not about the strategic plan being written kind of 8 months later, as soon as people are asked about what are their ideas and what might we do as an organization, they're already making those changes. And so there's this incredible momentum and personal agency that takes place when you use it for big strategic planning projects like that. And we do a lot of those with colleges and universities mostly, but not-for-profits and all kinds of organizations.
Go ahead,
I
Jeanie.
was
Sorry.
just going to say, and we talked also about the notion of shift, because this is leadership shift that we're talking about. But it's amazing in the room, and I like to work also with teams that are in trouble. They come because they need to change, they need to shift. And
I know that none of your leaders out there are working with teams that won't talk to each other, but this is Jeanie's specialty.
But one of the things about using Appreciative Inquiry that I absolutely love is the shift that I see as people start to deeply listen to each other's stories. Because one of the techniques that we use is we start with whatever the topic is. What is it you want? So in a team, it's often just being a highly effective team. So you tell stories, no matter how small, of when you've had an experience in the team that has been what was wonderful and made it effective, and share that with another person, then share it with a small group. And you start to see people say, wow, they see each other, because they see each other through the story. And they then have to start to shift and say, well, wait a minute, they're passionate about being this team just like I am. And I thought they were just an annoying person because they had different styles or whatever, right? But through that storytelling and the inquiry of the listening to each other deeply, it shifts that nature of belonging together, and then being able to come together and actually share the leadership. I mean, that's what a team is a group that works together, right? So then they actually see how they could, because they can see each other.
Right. It's so funny that you just added that, because I onboarded a new executive coaching client just this morning. And one of the questions that I asked was to tell me about a peak experience where, it doesn't, and it never has to be professional, it can be personal too. But in this case, it was a professional story. And it was earlier on in her career where, I can't be too detailed because of confidentiality, but let's just say she went above and beyond serving a client and the client's family in a very difficult situation, and did that because that she viewed that as her job. That was her purpose, wasn't just to do the job, but to serve the clients. And a couple of days later, the family came in with 24 roses to thank her for what she had done. And she was completely touched, because of course she didn't do it expecting to get roses or even thanked, because a lot of times it's somebody anonymous on the other side. And she said, well, what's the second dozen roses for? Because the first one was for her. And the client said, for your mother, because she obviously raised a wonderful human being. And hearing that story from her, well, hell, of course, it made me appreciate who she is as a person and as a professional. And, it again just got me thinking, like, these are the kinds of stories that we need to perpetuate and tell our coworkers, and not be either too modest or think that they're inappropriate. Like, this is what connects us to each other.
And this is something that I think is the core of David Cooper-Ryder's and others' work when they started Appreciative Inquiry, is the connection to each other. That Appreciative Inquiry connects us in powerful ways, uplifts our strengths, connects us to the work that we want to do in the world, and gives us the ability to carry that work forward. And so the sense of connection in Appreciative Inquiry is so profound. And Jeanie and I have this experience too, where people tell incredibly powerful stories when asked that simple question, tell me a story of a time. And people tell these incredible stories of their lives and work.
And one of the principles of Appreciative Inquiry is the wholeness principle. So it's not about like a top down, here's the leader going to do this to the organization. It's about gathering the whole, or at least
Okay.
representation of the whole, who then work together, creating their future.
Right.
It's future focused, right? So they start with the stories about what they already know that's working well in the organization. And they move towards actually dreaming and visioning and creating images and together. Everything's done together collaboratively. So it's very much of an inclusive sort of belonging in this organization. This is us. To the design phase, which is a very typical phase of any sort of strategic planning or future creation, visioning, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
But in appreciative inquiry, that strat plan doesn't just get written up by a few people and stick on a shelf or passed out, maybe. It is actually something that has within it some commitments of everybody who's participated to be somehow part of it and to carry it on. And there's an ongoing process of looking back and doing an appreciative inquiry as where are we at? What's worked with this plan? How could we tweak it now? So it's very alive. It's very active in terms of how people engage with it. And that I think is very powerful, is to keep, and then of course it affects the institution in many ways, that people realize it's not just about doing what they committed to, but it could be a way of just being in their department with each other and holding meetings together by starting with, well, let's just share a brief story about what's happened since the last time we met last month. Just let's go around the table. It doesn't take long, and share a little story about the successes that
Right. You know, I want to pause 1 second to address the listeners and challenge you. Do you have these elements in your strategic planning process? Because I see a lot of strategic plans that are built kind of like this. Well, let's take last year's strategic plan and update it. Well, that is probably not the most thorough approach that you could take. Are you involving other constituencies, or are you just up there in the ivory tower in the C-suite creating the strategic plan without reaching out to people all across the organization to hear their voices and hear their stories, to build a future that is resonant for the entire organization and not just for those at the top? So I just want to call that to your attention. It's not too late. Every day is a new day to do a strategic plan. We're a month in to 2021. If you built a strategic plan, revisit it with the appreciative inquiry approach in mind. So we've been alluding a little bit, and I want to go there directly to the applications for appreciative inquiry in diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Such a big topic that, fingers crossed, may finally be having its day, where, you know, more people are taking it seriously than just the groups advocating for it. So talk to us a little bit about why this is such an important element for DEI.
Well, I think that there's so much intrinsically in appreciative inquiry that speaks to the notion of belonging. To be simply asked to be part of something is kind of integral to change at the scale of the whole,
Yes.
as David says. But I think there's particular things that appreciative inquiry brings to this work. David Cooper Ryder and Ron Fry recently wrote an article based on a piece that David wrote for the preface to our book about appreciative inquiry in a broken world. And they too are really thinking about this idea of how in situations where there is huge hurt and huge harm and systemically built-in systems, do we begin to unpack them? And I think appreciative inquiry really brings itself to that work. The ways in which you sit down and begin to discuss topics like, how might we as a team be inclusive of each other? Simple question, right? Recognizing at the same time that there are moments within every team, within every organization, where that has not existed. Every organization brings the systemic nature of the society in which they function inside their organization. And so this is, the being fully aware part of appreciative in the appreciative inquiry. The recognition that the solution isn't going to happen by 4 o'clock this afternoon, that this is the beginning of a conversation around huge and systemic kinds of issues. You're dying to add something, I can tell.
No, I'm just enjoying what you're
Okay.
saying, Joan. It's great.
And so I think it has a special place there because it's built out of telling stories. Tell a story of a time in your organization where you felt like you belonged. And even more complex, given that there's huge systemic issues at play inside and outside our organization. Tell a story of a time where you felt like you belonged. And so you recognize the being fully aware of what is in the systemic nature, and you seek to find places that can be different. And so it's delicate and powerful work on appreciative inquiry. And I think there's much to be gained by the simple telling and asking of stories, and then beginning to create change.
Yeah, okay. And I think this is a really good conversation for folks who want to be allies, for lack of a better word. They don't think that they're overtly, let's say, racist or sexist or any other ism. But they're not necessarily even aware of some of their own unconscious biases or unconscious isms that might be in their behavior. And they want to learn, they want to do better, but they don't know how to broach the topic with people of color or women or, whatever, the other is. And I think this is a really, certainly not easy, but, it's a simple way for them to start practicing to have those conversations, to get the information, to be more informed and sensitive, to tell me about a time when, so that they can start to educate themselves. Because that's really what it's going to take, is people understanding, what it feels like to live in the other person's shoes by hearing those powerful examples.
Well, as you say, I think there's an incredible moment for allyship, and it is such a fragile thing, right? Because it's easy to take allyship to yet a new version of oppression, right? It's a really complicated territory. Right. And yet I think for leaders to step into that territory and both say powerfully to their organization, not on my watch. Yeah. This is a place I expect that everybody experiences respect. Now tell me stories of how we're already doing that and how we can enable more of it. Such a simple question, right? And so it begins, so it is, I think, a powerful place for leaders who seek to be allies to reside.
Yeah. So let's go over that again, just to make sure people got it. And, it is Black History Month. And so certainly a great time to continue to advocate for people of color and allyship. So let's give people verbatim questions, because sometimes they need that in order to get started, and then they feel more comfortable, because a lot of times it is opening their mouth and saying those first few words or the first sentence that's hard for people.
And so I think let's think about an executive, for example, to say to their team, how might I express to the organization my expectation of inclusion? How might we begin to set simple kinds of expectations around belonging? How might we invite people to the conversation without asking the employees who self-identify as people of color or gay and lesbian to suddenly speak for everybody in the organization? How do we do this in a way that's powerful? So two really beginning questions. And I think the other thing that I often say to CEOs that I'm coaching is a journaling exercise. And this is not a share exercise. This is a writing down, where is it that I intersect with these issues in powerful ways? And I use a simple, powerful example of myself. Jeanie and I are life partners, business partners, co-authors, right? We live in a country of peace and privilege where we can be married in our country and not universally, but for the most part, not discriminated against for that.
Sure.
My colleagues, and so Jeanie and I get to sit down the burden, if you want to call it that. It's a bad word. Sit down the notion of being lesbian at times, right? We can appear in public and people go, oh yeah, they're interesting people. My friends of color can never do that.
Right.
And so I think to journal about this idea of how we intersect with privilege and difference for ourselves, and then begin to ask the questions. How might I communicate to the organization my desire to create a culture of belonging? How might we begin the conversation? Are there places inside the organization where teams, very diverse teams, are flourishing? What is enabling those teams to flourish? And then take those enablers and say, okay, how can we take those enablers to other divisions in our organization? So what do you want to add?
I just want to add that, the more that people are seen to belong, so the kinds of questions like, even just tell the stories of your lives in the last month. And it doesn't have to be something that, is there something that you need to share with us? Because we all belong here. We all appreciate each other for our strengths. And what is it that is affecting you? Like even just those kinds of questions to get to the heart of people, to hear their stories from their lives, ask them about that. And the more that kind of focus on the people and appreciating through the curiosity of the stories of their lives, the more likely those stories will be shared and people will start to learn from each other, in terms of that not everybody has the same life. I mean, the amount of privilege we have just because of the color of our white skin is just incredible. And many people who are white have never even thought of that. And so sometimes just getting into what does that look like, right? Well, I can walk into a bank and nobody's going to think, I'm there to rob it or something. All sorts of things, that assumptions that can be made because if you don't have a white skin, right? So to me, that's one of the most important privileges. And Joan's saying the intersectionality of privilege, because we have oppression in other ways and so on. Yes. Everybody can look at that, but to have those kinds of conversations of what it does mean in terms of worrying about your children, right? If you're Black and your children are off to school, are you worried that they'll make it there safely? So right. Just because of the color of the skin, we know those stories exist. They're becoming more and more prevalent, which is good because it's bringing an awareness to the world that, wait a minute now, not everybody has the same safety we have to live in the world fully as possible, right? So I think those kinds of tough questions are just, again, through the notion of story and how it impacts them. And when they come into this teamwork, what has impacted them that might affect it differently because they look different than other people.
Right. Yeah. So leadershifters, like all work, it starts here inside of you.
Yes.
And so I love that Joan and Jeanie are suggesting, before you even go out publicly and have this conversation with your team or with your org to, and whether it's journaling or discussing it with a coach or, a trusted partner or an advisor or, just meditating on it. Love the question. I'm going to have to read it. How do you intersect with privilege and difference yourself? And be honest about that, because it's in sharing honestly and with vulnerability with your teams and your organizations that people are going to be willing are going to be invited into the conversation because they'll see you're for real as opposed to full of shit and just trying to check a box because it's the flavor of the day or because your board of directors is demanding it. No, this needs to come from a place of humanity within you. And we all intersect with this in obvious places and not so obvious places.
Let me tell a really quick story related to this. This is not a new story, it goes back several years, but I was sitting in a circle of colleagues, and I actually write about this in the book, sitting in a circle of colleagues, and we're all introducing ourselves, right? And the woman sitting next to me, who I've never met, a woman of color, gets to be her turn. She talks about where she grew up and you know, city in Canada and so on. And somebody across the room says, "Where are you from?" And she says, "Montreal." And they said, no, where are you really from? And so one of the things I challenge leaders to do is to practice allyship in the moment. And in this moment, I got it right. And lots of times I've gotten it wrong, but in this moment, I got it right. I'm sitting next to her and I think, okay, I can just let this go on by, or I can do something. And so I said, you know, you got asked a really powerful question. Let's begin again and talk about where we're from. And I'll start while other people think about this. And I talked about my heritage, my Celtic heritage, how my family got to Canada, how many generations we've been in Canada. And I said, let's go back to the beginning of the circle and start again. Where are you really from? And I've stayed in contact with that woman for 20 years, off and on. Almost every time she tells that story of how powerful it was of somebody simply interrupting racism, not trying to make it right by saying to the other person, don't ask that question, but actually interrupting it. And I think there's something powerful in our allyship in moments where we can appreciatively interrupt exclusion. So you don't tell somebody else they're wrong. You think, what can be made right here?
Yes.
Well, let's tell the stories of where we're really from. Let's begin again. Where are we really from? And so it just changed that whole feeling, because I wasn't the only person in the room going, you know, okay, what do I do now?
Right. People like wanting to crawl under the seat, going, oh shit, this is happening. Yeah, and right. Oh, well, that's a very powerful example of how to put this to use in allyship in the moment. I like that you call it that. That's that's what's going to make the difference, is catching people in the moment. Oh, so good. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. I mean, it's all obviously related, but to be authentically alive.
Well, that is actually an acronym. We're using the word ALIVE as an acronym.
Yeah, I love acronyms. Bring it on.
Yes. And while we were writing a chapter in the book on Appreciative Inquiry in Higher Ed first, and then it's continued on into our Building Resilience, because it was such a model that worked and people really loved it. So A.L.I.V.E actually stands for a model to be able to work with when things are really challenging.
Okay.
And the A.L.I.V.E actually stands for, the A is appreciate, of course, we're writing about appreciative inquiry. And then the L is actually, I don't know, I think my favorite part of the A.L.I.V.E model, which is the love. You know, who are you supporting? Who supports you in this challenging time? Where is the love around you? And then, of course, the I, A-L-I, is inquiry, because you do all of this, you know, be appreciating and loving inquiry by, you know, being curious about what's going on in this challenging time. So if you focus on those three, we say then the rest of ALIVE is the V and the E. And the V and the E are really supported by appreciating, loving, and inquiring in order to venture and take that step forward into the next stage as you evolve in your life. But the story I want to tell with this
is, so what's the V and the E?
V is the venture.
Oh.
You step forward into a venture. Yeah, sorry. A-L-I-V is the venture. And that's the stepping forward into your future through this challenging time. And then E is the evolve, because you're never the same. And all of us are always evolving,
Okay.
but you're never the same. So how are you evolving, right?
Got it.
And the actual acronym came when when we were writing the book, after I almost died in a very serious car accident, not even knowing I'd been in it. Woke up several days after the accident, after a titanium nail was put in my femur. My ribs were crushed, my hips were crushed, my femur was, I almost lost my leg. Joan had to decide whether or not they would take my leg or try to
Wow.
operate, and so on. And so I woke up, and it was, last memory I had was facilitating a fabulous Appreciative Inquiry training session that I'd driven home from, but I didn't make it home. Somebody drove right into me, pushed me into oncoming traffic. I was schmucked into a very tiny space. Luckily, I survived, but I woke up thinking, what's going on? I'm intubated because my lungs been crushed and punctured. Joan is beside me. My sister Joan, who lived on the other side of the country, was there at the end of the bed. Why would she be here? And then all these medical people. And I thought, wow, I don't know, but I am alive. I'm alive. And I felt really,
And that's something to appreciate.
yeah, I really was happy. And I've got love around me and people taking care of me. And, so I don't know what this is, but I was curious. And I realized the embedding nature of my world as Appreciative Inquiry. I just was there happy to be alive. And so that became our acronym, because it has the things. I appreciated, as I healed, I appreciated what I could do rather than what I couldn't do. I mean, there were so many things I couldn't do. But any tiny little step forward, literally for me, learning to walk again and so on, each of those moments I appreciated. And I thought, well, what can I do next? And I had love around me in the hospital. I was in the hospital for 6 weeks and many months of physio, et cetera, afterwards. But I continued to venture. I continued to take that step, whatever the next step I could do, in order to evolve. And, yes, I still have a titanium nail in my leg. I walk perfectly well, but I don't have much rotation in that leg. So after walking for quite a long time, I'll get, tired because it's being stressed. So this is how many years later? 10, 11 years later now. So, but we go through the challenges. There's that appreciative inquiry mindset, and really focusing on what is the love around us, that we take those steps, that we make. And all through COVID and stuff, it's this A.L.I.V.E model has been brilliant, because we've all had to venture different ways. Our business is all virtual now, instead of going to speak at places, and everything is evolving. We're having to learn all sorts of new things, which is not a bad thing, because our accessibility is huge now. People worldwide are easily getting into to hear us and work with us. So it's quite wonderful.
One of the things
in its horribleness, because we want to hug people too.
One of the things we write about in the A.L.I.V.E model about venture and evolve is we write about the fact that when we face a challenging time as a leader, can be small or can be enormous, that kind of challenge that brings us to our knees as a leader, we are forever and irrevocably changed. And so as we venture and evolve, we are becoming new leaders. We're venturing into new ways of being human in our work. And so we write a lot about venturing, evolving isn't about everything turning out okay. It's about evolving into what is next in our leadership lives. And it's not an easy place to practice appreciative inquiry, but to still ask those generative questions. What did I get to do today? What have I ventured? How am I evolving?
Right. So of course that ties, as we've already alluded to, so nicely to the last year of all of our lives. And it's not the new normal, it's the next normal, because things keep changing. And I love the A.L.I.V.E model, even just for COVID. And a connection that I just sort of made and want to ask you about is, all right, so people have been now, in most cases, in close quarters with their family or their quarantine buddies, or whatever it is, because I certainly wouldn't want to exclude single people And I know a lot of single people have a few friends that are their quarantine family. You two have, as you said, your life partners, your business partners, you live together, you work together. You were sort of spending a lot more time together before COVID than most people are spending together with COVID. So how do you use appreciative inquiry to keep all of those pieces of your life thriving when it would be so easy for you guys to get sick and tired of each other?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I think one of the simple things that we do is we have a gratitude practice. So we start every morning with what we're grateful for. And what it does is lift up those things, even though we can't fly around the world, we can't, work face to face with our clients, all those things that we've done as a business for years. What are we grateful for in this environment?
Yeah.
And, and jokingly, if one of us runs an errand without the other, we're really excited because we've had an experience without the other person, I mean,
then we get to talk about when we come back.
We get to talk about like, how was the traffic, and so, there is those jokes also, those appreciative jokes within this very kind of closed system.
Right.
And I think, as you said, Jeanie and I think in COVID are lucky because we have worked together, written together, lived together for a long time. And so we're used to that kind of relationship of being close. And one of the things I think is powerful about appreciative inquiry in COVID is to seek the answer to the question, how am I profoundly embracing what is happening to me right now? How am I making it mine? Right? Because I think there's this sense sometimes in COVID, you want to push it away, but it's not going anywhere. We talk about this when we write about despair. And COVID's kind of an example of large scale despair. We can't have what it is we want. And that impacts how we feel and our mental health. And we write about what is your tiniest strength in this time? How might you fan the flame of that strength ever so slightly?
Great.
And for Jeanie and I, one of our tiny strengths is that joke about one of us running an errand without the other. And it's like a joke between us as well as an actual thing, right? What are the tiny flames that we can fan in this time of huge difference?
Right.
And we like to be together. Like we love to go walking, right? And so, well, if somebody's really busy, then the other one will go walking. And that's really a lovely thing to do, to have separation. But most of the times we go walking together and just getting out of the house and being in a beautiful environment. We live right by the ocean. And so we then are with each other in a different way than when we're in the house. So even togetherness can create variety if you get out into the open.
Absolutely. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask the question, the devil's advocate question, which is for those people who tend towards being, negative Nellies or, whatever you want to call it, who would say, that's all good and well, but, that's just living in la la land to always try and be positive and, blah, blah, blah. That's just not, you're just not being realistic. You're trying to blow smoke up people's, the people. I'm quite certain that there's an appreciative inquiry way that you would respond to that.
Well, I would respond by saying, oh, tell me more. Like if somebody is really feeling down and low and everything, you don't ignore any of that. It goes back to that whole notion of the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Appreciation means to appreciate what is. So don't, either in yourself or in others, don't say I'm not going to focus on that because it's not positive. That's not appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry isn't about the positive ruling the world. It is about, if you focus more on what's working, what people's strengths are, seeing people for who they are, all of that is going to make you feel better, right? And also it's going to make them feel better. So it's not about saying, oh, I'm going to be positive, so I'll say, oh, I love your red shirt, Jeanie. Well, that's not appreciative inquiry. So people don't Actually,
Those are empty compliments, right?
people that you described like that, they have no understanding of what we're talking about, which is to really appreciate the world as it is and everybody as they are, and to value what needs to be the deep listening. And we're talking about
Right.
leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, I think deep listening more than anything, and asking really generative questions, which could be simply, tell me more about that. If it's something that's coming at you like this, just appreciating that they need to be talking about things that aren't so good, right? And it's
Yeah.
not about changing them into a positive person. That's not what we're talking about. Yeah, there's all sorts of different kinds of moods that we have every single day.
Yeah.
And that where we get in our book about building resilience, we get into the notion of forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, how important that piece is as we live in despair. And our hope is to be back in hope, and hope not to get what you want, but that it'll be as it should be. As with my accident, I'm alive and well, but I didn't know that but I had the hope that whatever this is, it's meant to be, and how can I be in it? What can I do now? What's working now? It's that whole appreciative stance of looking at the world curiously through what can be.
And sometimes I ask people who want to talk about everything that's wrong, as Jeanie says, deeply listen, but then to ask them, what is it you're really yearning for?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And to find
what's the dream beneath the complaint.
To find the yearning beneath the complaint, because every complaint has a yearning.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that yearning is the territory of appreciative inquiry. What is it you're really wanting as a leader? What are you trying to understand? What are you seeking to do? And then suddenly they're beginning to reframe that negativity into yearning. And in doing so, a path forward opens. Because when we're standing, looking down at our feet, talking about what's wrong, we're stuck in that place.
Yeah.
You know, it feels powerful when we're doing it, but we're stuck in that place. But if we can transform it into a yearning, suddenly there's a path forward.
Love that. Speaking of path forward, I would love to invite you to read a short poem from your book. I know you said it was full of poetry, and I would love to kind of close out on that note.
So this poem is from the Building Resilience with Appreciative Inquiry book. And it's a poem about hope.
Wow, let's come back to hope.
And Jeanie gave a wonderful definition of hope. It's not about being, thinking that something's going to happen just because we want it to happen. It's about deeply understanding that the path we're on, there's something powerful here to be had. My beautiful friend, hope. You point me toward the sun, you shelter me in the rain. You trumpet my successes and hold me in my sorrow, ever whispering, rise up, rise up.
Thank you. Ladies, if folks would like to know more or engage with services or get a copy of the book, what's the best way to reach you?
Best way to find us is on our website, cockell.McArthur-Blair.com. All of our books, of course, are available on any electronic bookseller these days, or if you're brave, going into a regular bookseller, our books are available in any bookseller. Probably the best way to connect with us is through our website, and you're welcome to put up our contact information at the end of this. That would be delightful. And we, not just in terms of people coming to us as clients, but we're part of Appreciative Inquiry community around the world. And so if people want to explore Appreciative Inquiry and just want to have a coffee chat about, I've been thinking about this Appreciative Inquiry thing and I don't even know where to start, we're always up for that as well. So
great. Thank you for that. And thank you for coming on the show. And I will absolutely post the website link in the show notes and so forth. So leadershifters, I hope that you enjoyed today's show as much as I did. And it always amazes me that, I can have folks on the show talking about a concept with which I'm already pretty familiar, and it blows my mind how much I still learn and take away. I mean, some of the questions that you ladies shared that I wrote down, I will recommend, use for myself and recommend to others. How do you intersect with privilege and difference yourself? How can we be allies in the moment? I'm trying to read my own writing. How might we set expectations about belonging in this, team, group, organization, soccer team, whatever it is, right? How might we invite more people to the conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? And then, of course, the A.L.I.V.E acronym for helping us get through tough times, the current COVID period. Included in that A.L.I.V.E, appreciate, love, inquiry, to getting curious in those difficult times, and then taking one small step to venture into the future as we evolve. So thank you for evolving with me on the Leadership Show. You know how to reach me on the various social media outlets or Jeanie at theleadershipshow.com. Until next time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeanie.
Thanks so much.